no matter what their name is. And we hope that we can bring them back around, that all of them would have an awakening like Brandon Darby. And he's one of the most interesting people, and I can't wait for him to tell his story. And I'm so grateful that he would come all the way here to Pennsylvania. So Brandon Darby, come on up. So, thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Mummers, this is interesting. I've never seen a mummer in my life. I never even knew they existed. I've never been here before. I've never been to Philadelphia. I've never been to Pennsylvania.
Welcome to Philadelphia.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you know, how many of you are doing the phone banking? How many of you have been doing phone banking? You've done it, and how many of you have knocked on doors with the little pads? Did they give you the pads? The what are those things called? The tablets. Did you get a tablet and go to the doors and so forth? Well, this is pretty significant because I was in Virginia recently, right? And AFP Virginia had me come in, and I talked 4 weekends in a row to different phone bankers, the folks doing what you're doing. And afterwards, talking to people, what I started to learn was that people were getting tired, and some people weren't necessarily seeing the point in what they were doing because they get shut doors and they get people hanging up and people telling them they're racist. And they even have the gall, like a lot of times on the left, to call black people racist who work with conservatives, you know? And so, you know, just talking with people, I've kind of realized what was going on. And then I started to really think about like what it means when you go door to door. You call people as a person, you call someone as an individual, and what that challenge is. So my own story is kind of a strange one, and it's actually kind of boring. I won't bore you with it, but I'll give you a brief synopsis before I get to where I want to go. So I ran away from home when I was 13, and I stayed gone for 2 years, almost 2 years. And at the end of those 2 years, I was always kind of, I was always a little bit confused because so many of the people that I had been on the street with, they ended up with addiction problems, or they ended up dead, and all kinds of troubles. Which is even more so true as I get older and I look back at some of those people, and most of them aren't here anymore. They went in a different path than I did. And so helping people was always something that mattered to me. I started to really feel like there was some reason that I didn't get incarcerated or get addicted or die or have all these other problems that these runaway kids I was with had. And so I've always had this big desire to help people, and this big issue with people when I feel like people are oppressing other people or taking advantage of other people. It's always made me very angry. And how many of you have been called a racist or realize that half the country thinks you're a racist? You realize that, right? Okay, because it's true. Even though you're not, they think it. And that's because there's a false narrative in our society. And that false narrative goes like this. It says if you want to help other people, then you're a leftist, or you're a liberal, or you're on the left, you vote left. And if you want to help rich white people oppress other people, then you vote right. And that's a false narrative that all of our nighttime comedians promote. It's a false narrative that most of our media promotes, except for Fox, but most of them do. You know, all of the big super PACs, basically, like ABC, NBC, CBS, you know, CNN, and we could go on and on. But this is the dominant narrative pushed in music. It's the dominant narrative pushed in our movies. It's the dominant narrative pushed in everything. And so I really fell into that when I was a teenager. And I thought that my being radical, which I still am about helping people, meant that I was somehow a leftist. And I moved to Austin, Texas, which is kind of like the Berkeley of the South or something, you know. It's a very radical leftist city. There's a lot of radical leftism there. And a lot of the nation's radical leaders live in that city. And so in my desire to help people, I met them. They took me under their wing. And next thing you know, one of my mentors was the SCIU. How many of you know about the SCIU? It was their chief organizer, Lisa Fithian. And one of my mentors was Medea Benjamin from Code Pink. And a couple of my mentors were really prominent former Black Panther Party members. And they were decent people. They helped me help people. I had access. And then I got involved in the Palestinian cause. And I thought Israel was horrible. And people started to teach me about the true American history. And I began to see history from a perspective of America, like most liberals do. And it's just a fact, is that I began to blame the world's ills on our economic system and on our country itself. And I kept that with me for years. Well, long story short, a hurricane hit New Orleans called Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and I found myself co-founding a relief organization with some very prominent former left of center people, like Michael Moore gave us money, Medea gave us money, Soros ended up giving money. I mean, we could go down the list of all the groups who gave money and funded us, and we were very radical. But I found myself in charge of an area called the 9th Ward, and it was a predominantly black, low-income area, but it was working low-income people, about 11,000 homes, and I found myself being the person in charge of the relief and aid for that area. And then I found myself realizing that it wasn't George Bush, but it was the local government, most of whom were black leadership, so it wasn't a racism issue, but it was the local government exploiting laws and exploiting people to try to use eminent domain for private commercial development to take 11,000 homes from people because they wanted that area for development. And they wouldn't let the people come back. So I found myself fighting for these people's homes, and I began to have differences and realize that I didn't agree with any policy issues at all. Like, my leftism wasn't that I believed in policy. My leftism was simply that I was radical about helping people, and I had believed something falsely. And so I could go on and on about the examples and things that came up when I began to do interviews, and I would say, hey, these people, if eminent domain for private commercial development is allowed here, what that's going to do to private property rights across the country is going to be detrimental. And then my leaders would say, Brandon, we don't talk about private property rights. And I was like, why not? They're like, because we don't believe in them. And it's like, well, wait a minute, I believe in private property rights. So we began to have issues. So I'm going to skip the boring stuff about when Hugo Chavez invited my group to Venezuela, and I went and saw the most impoverished people I've ever seen in my life. You know, the government tour was so lovely. It really was, what he did with the socialized wealth from PDVSA and the oil industry. But the problem was when you got out of the 3 barrios that he had on the tour and you looked at the other barrios, I saw a level of poverty that I never saw in the United States. You know, he wasn't doing anything for those people with that socialized money at all. And I began to realize that even in the midst of Hurricane Katrina, Americans had it a lot better off than people in Venezuela did. And so long story short, I came back. There were a number of things that were going on, and I decided I was just going to back away from my leftist friends. And I was very confused because I was like, well, wait a minute, you know? I don't agree with these people. I don't agree with the methodology. I don't agree with the way they appoint people in leadership. I don't agree with, you know, our security team in a really rough area. I don't agree with them like appointing like a 17-year-old young lady who they want to empower rather than someone who knows how to do the job or has experience. And I began to realize that I started to have very distinct methodology and policy views that were different from the people around me, but I still wasn't a racist conservative. Not at all. But I began to realize the difference. So I got away, I went back to Texas, and one of the men I had worked with so ardently to help the innocent Palestinians against the evil, oppressive Israelis, you know, at that time, I thought that, he ran a very large nonprofit called the Palestinian Children's Welfare Fund. And the Palestinian Children's Welfare Fund, I think it was the largest in the U.S. that was led by a Palestinian for the Palestinian innocent children. And he was sending several $100,000 a year, you know, 5, 6, 700,000. Well, he came to me and he had come up with a plan to skim off he actually did skim off the money, but to skim off the money and then secretly get it to Israel and for the Palestinians for suicide bombings. And I said, well, why do you need to secretly do that if you already send so much money legally? And he's like, he told me why. So I said, okay. So long story short, I decided that not only did I need to get away from those people, but I needed to actually do something. I was always proud of how I helped people. I was always proud. I still am. I'm proud of what I did for people in New Orleans, but I wasn't proud of the things I said. I wasn't proud of my worldview. I wasn't proud of the fact that I went around with my loud mouth saying things that were detrimental about our country and about our system, and I began to appreciate the system. And so I said, you know, I need to do something to pay it back. And I wasn't in trouble. I didn't violate the law. I didn't do anything wrong, but I felt morally wrong. And so I said, well, I'm going to do something to expose these people for what they are. I'm going to expose the fact that some of the most moderate people in left-of-center politics are very closely tied to some of the people that were my mentors. A little too close for my comfort. And it would be for yours if you knew the details. So I went to the FBI. They raided this guy's house. It turns out what I was saying was true. And he ends up, he ends up killing himself, horrible deal, and there was really nobody I could talk about it with because it was so upsetting, but I didn't want to damage their investigation, and I wanted to make amends to the people of Israel, and so I tried my best to, and I actually think at this point I have. I've done what I can to protect life. Well, so they came to me and said, why don't you work undercover with us and help us? And I said, you know what? You're right, I should. And I did. And so I spent the next 2 years working undercover with the Joint Terrorism Task Force in the International Terrorism Division of the FBI. And that it's a boring story, I could tell you, but that kind of culminated to this bomb plot at the 2008 Republican National Convention. And then what happened is I was undercover as an anarchist, and I had a beard, and I was dirty, and I hadn't bathed in a month. And I was traveling with the group that we now call Occupy, but they weren't called Occupy at the time. And long story short, they tried to shut down the Republican National Convention by any means necessary. How many of you remember the 2008 RNC? How many of you knew, I bet you didn't, how many of you knew there were 3 bomb plots that the left did to try to burn and maim Republicans and cops? How many of you know that? Yeah, well, here's what's interesting about that. I'm going to explain this to you. Is the way that worked out was there was about 10 or 11,000 protesters who were coming, and they were just liberal protesters, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, they were just simply they thought they were better in the country by protesting, right? That's fine. But the problem was they were organized by a group called United for Peace and Justice. And United for Peace and Justice is led by a woman named Lisa Fithian, okay? Now, Lisa Fithian, how many of you remember the SEIU helping elect our president? Yeah. Okay. Lisa Fithian is also the chief organizer for the SEIU. So far, no problem. She's chief organizer for the SEIU. She's leading the mainstream Democratic protest against the Republicans. No problem. But there was another effort that formed called the RNC Welcoming Committee. And they set out with the explicit stated goal to shut the RNC down by any means necessary. And do you know who was leading that effort? The same Lisa Fithian. So that's the problem. You start to see the relationships here and the problems. So, long story short, I testify against these bomb makers. My identity comes out to the public, and the left media began to attack me horribly. And at the point that they did that, I was offered witness protection, and I decided that I didn't do anything wrong. And I decided probably the best thing I could do for our country was not to go on witness protection, but to actually start to speak out against what they were saying. Because one of the things that bothered me is that when I was such a young, compassionate, caring person, they took they took that passion and that fire in me, and they turned it into a hatred of this country. Because they misrepresented historical situations. Not that our country hasn't made mistakes, but I tell you what, we haven't made half as many as most countries have we? And I tell you what, we've consistently gotten better, haven't we? We used to have slavery. We used to have all kinds of bad things, just like everyone else did. But our nation has consistently gotten better. And we want to change something for the better. I started to learn it doesn't change overnight when something's wrong. We can't change it overnight because we have institutionalized checks and balances. And I began to realize that the best thing for social justice or for fairness for the poor was this country and what we do, and not less of us, but more of us. And I said, I'm going to start to talk back. And I said, you know what, they're going to sit here and represent that I somehow did something wrong to these bomb makers, or that the Republicans deserved it, in opposition to the Republicans' racist policies. Young men go too far. And it's like, well, no, they didn't go too far. They tried to burn people, and they came to shut another group of Americans down. And you say, well, how could they do that? How can they get that many people to be okay with shutting you down, saying you don't have the right to speak, and if you show up, we're going to burn you and maim you and throw Molotovs at you? And it's because of the dehumanization that occurs. It's the same dehumanization that made me not like you and made me a leftist when I really wasn't one. It's that dehumanization that's so strong and so powerful. And so I have spent the last few years traveling around telling my story and making sure that people realize that the men and women of law enforcement do a good job, that our ally Israel, there's more to that story than the left says about that history. I'm not going to get into the foreign policy issues, but I'm going to tell you what, they're allies, I support them, There's more to the story about our economic system, because when I began to come to the conservative side, I could have cared less about economics. when it comes to money. I don't have money. I never have, and I probably never will, because of the way I live my life. You know, I look at it like a ministry. I just don't, just talking, but I just don't live up to it. I smoke, I do all these things. I don't live up to being a minister, you know. But I look at it like a ministry, so I'll probably never have it. But I came to this side not because of money or business. I came to this side because the same concepts that Tony just talked about a free market system, about not having a decentralized group of decision makers or a centralized group of decision makers making decisions for everyone's business, because it destroys the economy. Well, you know what else it destroys? That model destroys the way people help people. You know, if you're an elderly person and I didn't point at anyone here because none of you are elderly, but if you are an elderly person, I'm gonna tell you what, if you save a little bit, if you save just a little bit, they punish you for it. The interest rates that you're punished. You can't now, they want you dependent on government. You know, if you're someone and you decide to get people from your church and there's this Frankenstorm's coming, and you decide that you're going to get your church to, each one's going to open up and accept a family until they get on their feet again after their homes are destroyed. You're going to go to the Red Cross, and you know what you're going to find? And I'm not insulting the Red Cross. Thank God they're there. But it's the liberal model. What you're going to find is that when you go in, they're going to say, these are ours. We got it. Because they believe in the liberal model is a faraway, centralized group of superior people make decisions about how people are helped. That discourages us from helping others, and it hurts us, our ability to help people. Well, what I began to realize was that happening and the way people are helped is inextricably, it's a link to our economic system. The concept, this free market, it's this entrepreneurship that makes us so great. What social entrepreneurship in all of our states and our cities being able to decide how they help their own, that makes us so great and keeps us inventive and challenged. And here's the deal. All this stuff said is that I was a leftist, and if it wasn't for this cop, there was a cop in New Orleans. His name was John Bryson. I hated cops. I used to call cops pigs. I used to call them pigs. That's what I used to talk like. I hung out with Panthers. I hated them. I hated soldiers. I was horrible in that. But this cop began to reach out to me and began to try to work with me to help people. And he and I ended up starting a shelter together, and we worked together. I met his family. And do you know that in the process of him meeting me face to face and working with me, the dehumanization against patriotic cops and patriotic people began to wither away. He was no longer a racist pig. He was a good person who was doing the best he could. And then, once the dehumanization was gone, then it was just argument versus argument. And I'm going to tell you something. Our argument for liberty stands a lot stronger than the left argument I used to believe. It really does. And so I'm going to tell you this to end on this. When you call people and you go door to door, you know, when you do that, you're doing what that cop did. Now, that cop had no way to know that I would go on and stop bomb plots and work undercover and try to save people's lives. He had no way to know that. He was just being a good person and making himself human. And that's what you do. And so when you go to a door and you say, hi, I'm with AFP, and they're in their minds, they're thinking, AFP, that's Coke money. Those are racist conservatives. And you show up and you're a kind person and you're there to talk with somebody. You break down the dehumanization. You know, and that's the best thing that you can do. So as tiring as it is to go around and talk to people and try to interact with people and have people be rude to you, you need to understand that you might change somebody's mind or their life. You might not only help save the country, but you never know what that person will go on to do. You never know what effect you have. And so what you're doing, by calling people and going door to door, it's the most important thing someone can do during this election. It really is, to help fight for our country. So with that, I say thank you for having me. And I really appreciate this place and all of you. Thank you.